Hi guys. I thought a nice thing to do while the school is closed is to read you guys some stories that you can listen to if you get bored. So, I'm going to read you Edison. Now, Edison's a pretty big book, like. Alright. So, I'm going to read part of it today, and then tomorrow we'll read the rest of it. It's a beautiful book. So, it's written and illustrated. That means the pictures are done by a man named Torben Kuhlmann. And it's a story about a little mouse. Now, in real life, Edison is an inventor, right? He invented the light bulb, Thomas Edison. So we'll see. Maybe our book is about that. Okay. So our first page, we have our little, sorry, my book is falling down. Okay, we have our little mice in the corner here. And it looks like we are in a bookshop or a library, maybe. And it's called Chapter 1, The University of Mice. Ka-ching! The sound of the cash register ran through the bookstore. Let's go, a mouse whistled, standing on a pile of books. Countless little mouse heads peeked out of their hiding places. A small boy who was buying a comic book was so deep in conversation with the shopkeeper that neither of them was paying attention to what was happening around them. It was the perfect moment. One after another, the mice hopped out from behind the books and shelves, zipping across the room on silent feet before disappearing into a mouse hole in the far corner of the shop. After a short climb through the walls, the mice finally reached their destination. They're in school. Behind the shelves lay the University of Mice. Here, any inquisitive mouse could learn everything there was to know about the history of mice. Mice who had traveled the world, mice who had made great discoveries, and also the achievements of people. For example, the invention of the steam engine and the electric light. The lectures were given by an elderly gray-furred mouse professor whose white whiskers formed a rather messy mustache all around his nose. After a long day of lessons, he would go back to his study and enjoy a quiet evening in his armchair. His thoughts would wander back to the good old days when he was young. The professor had had many adventures on his great quest for knowledge. Now, times were more peaceful, but unfortunately, in his view, they were also a bit more boring. He does have a very excellent mustache, I must say. Today, there was someone new. There was someone in the lecture room whom the professor had never seen before. A tiny pointed nose was poking out from behind the last row of chairs. The young mouse waited patiently until the lecture ended and all the mice made their way home. Then, very timidly, he went up to the front desk. "Excuse me, Professor, but I need your help," he said shyly. "You see, I'm looking for a treasure." The professor listened attentively. "Many years ago, my great... The young mouse paused and started counting on his toes the numbers of greats it must have been. But then he decided it didn't really matter how many there were, and so he began again. "Many years ago, one of my ancestors sailed across the Atlantic, and he took a large treasure with him." "Aha," said the professor. "Where exactly did you get this information?" "Here," squeaked the little mouse, reaching into his pockets and pulling out a piece of paper which he gave to the professor. He was prepared for questions. "He left this letter behind. He talks about the treasure and his journey to America. The piece of paper has been in our family's possession for generations. It's the last sign of life that we have of my ancestor." The letter didn't look like an ordinary piece of paper. It was all crumpled and yellow. It must have been very old. One edge was jagged, as it might have been torn out of a book. The professor studied the text. Written in old-fashioned mouse language, it did indeed tell the story of a sea voyage and a treasure. "Please, Professor, help me find the treasure," pleaded the young mouse. At first, the professor didn't know what to say. After all, he was a mouse of great learning and didn't have time for such fantasies. Nevertheless, there was something about the little mouse's story that fascinated him. To tell you the truth, he said, I'm not interested in missing treasures or maps with X that marks the spot, but maybe we can find out more about your lost ancestor. The young mouse beamed. Thank you, Professor. What's your name? The older mouse asked. Pete. Here we go. Here we are in a library by the looks of it. And they're looking through old archives because they didn't have the internet back then, so everything was written on paper. You couldn't just Google it. Chapter 3. Looking for clues. The two mice rummaged through a drawer full of files and old documents. All they knew was Pete's ancestor had sailed to America. The documents listed every ship that had ever crossed the Atlantic, and the only clue they had was the date on Pete's piece of paper. Look at this, the professor called Pete over. In one of the files was a photo that showed a group of people about to set sail on a ship to America. Look closely, said the professor. There, among all the suitcases. The light was bad, and with the naked eye all they could see was a vague shadow, but they wanted to have a closer look. So with great effort, the two of them heaved the heavy file out of the drawer and dragged it to a lamp. The magnifying glass showed a mouse. It was Pete's ancestor. He was standing among the suitcases, posing proudly for the camera. The mouse actually looked a bit like Pete, but he had twisted his whiskers into a rather ridiculous handlebar mustache. Your ancestor must have liked having his photo taken with humans, said the professor. He obviously found it a bit bold for a mouse to push his way into a people picture. We found him, squealed Pete in delight. The mystery was solved, and the treasure seemed close enough to touch. Only, when did the ship arrive? That was the question. The professor continued his search through the files and documents, and... We have a newspaper article about a transatlantic liner sinking. A liner is a boat. Oh dear, the ship the two mice were searching for had an accident and sunk many years ago. It had never reached America. The professor put on a pair of small, round spectacles and began to read. It looks like all the passengers were saved, he said, but the article only reports on what happens to the humans. Not a word was mentioned about the fate of the mice who had been on board. No other trace of Pete's ancestor could be found, no matter how closely they looked through the magnifying glass. They looked through photos that were taken later of the ship's crew and all of the rescued passengers, but there was no sign of the missing mouse. Here he's mapping and reading about the boats. With the help of the old newspaper clippings and entries from the ship's logbook, Pete and the professor were able to piece together the events that led up to the disaster. They marked the location of each one on a large map of the ocean. Where the line of the ship's progress ended, Pete drew a large X. This is the last known position of the liner, and so that must be where the mysterious treasure would be, at the bottom of the sea. Interesting, murmured Professor. What we have now really is a treasure map, and X marks the spot. The two mice studied the results of their investigation. That means the treasure will be lost forever, said Pete with a sigh. Whatever my ancestors had with him will stay at the bottom of the sea for the rest of time. No mouse could ever get to it. Never! He hung his head sadly. The professor looked into the distance and muttered meaningfully. Once upon a time, there were similar things said about a mouse getting to the moon. According to the professor, nothing was impossible for a mouse. Pete listened eagerly to his stories. The professor told him once a mouse had learned to fly and had crossed the Atlantic in a wobbly plane. Many years later, the very first Earthling to reach the moon had been a mouse. You see, one should never underestimate us mice, he said, finishing his lecture. A mouse can also get to the bottom of the sea. Incredible, squeaked Pete, who was impressed but still not convinced. Do you really think we could do it? What do you mean we? Asked the professor with a sniff and a snort. I am far too old for such adventures. When you've grown up enough, you can go and look for the treasure yourself. But I thought we'd start preparing for our diving expedition right away, said Pete, not giving up. But the professor was not persuaded, and finally started to leave. Delighted to have met you, Pete, and I wish you all the best. But, Professor, Pete shouted again, and there was no reply. All right, I'm going to stop there for today. We'll have to find out tomorrow if the professor goes with Pete on his underwater expedition to find the treasure. Until then.